Well, my sisters and brothers, not many of you should become teachers, because we know that we teachers will be judged more strictly. We all make mistakes often, but those who don't make mistakes with their words have reached full maturity. Like a bridled horse, they can control themselves entirely. When we bridle horses and put bits in their mouths to lead them wherever we want, we can control their whole bodies. Consider ships. They are so large that strong winds are needed to drive them, but pilots direct their ships wherever they want with a little rudder. In the same way, even though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts wildly. Think about this. A small flame can set a whole forest on fire. The tongue is a small flame of fire, a world of evil at work within us. It contaminates our entire lives. Because of it, the circle of life is set on fire. The tongue itself is set on fire by the flames of Gehenna, hell. People can tame and already have tamed every kind of animal, reptile, bird, or fish, but no one can tame the tongue, though. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it, we both bless the Lord and Father and curse human beings made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come from the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, it shouldn't be this way. Both fresh water and salt water don't come from the same spring, do they? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree produce olives? Can a grapevine produce figs? Of course not. And fresh water doesn't flow from a saltwater spring either. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A couple years ago, I was sitting around on a family vacation, sitting around with my family, my side of the family. It was there, my sister and her husband, my wife and I and our everybody's kids with my parents. The children had gone to bed, and we were sitting around relaxing and talking, and at some point, the conversation drifted to the subject of disciplining children, and I shared this memory in that time of having been in junior high, and in the midst of a heated argument with my mother said a cuss word. I share this memory because it has been singed in me with vivid detail. Now, I have to say this about my mother. A sailor on the high seas, she is not. There's this concept in Judaism called building a hedge around the Torah. On an incredibly simplistic level, it basically means that if I'm not supposed to do that thing, I don't get anywhere near it. So one of the 10 Commandments is don't take the Lord's name in vain. Well, how about we just don't even say God's name? How about more than that, we don't even write God's name. That way there's no chance I'm going to break that commandment. That was my mother's policy with profane language. Not only is she not going to cuss, she's not even going to say the common substitute words or any other words that could possibly be construed as cursing. And yet, clear as day, I have this memory of her cussing at me, telling me the way I was treating her. Now, my mother has no memory of this happened, and frankly, she can't and she refuses to believe that she did it to this day. She's like, I didn't do that, you're making that up, I didn't do that. But I can't forget it. It's singed into my memory because it shocked me enough in that moment to give me space and time to reconsider my behavior and to set me on a different path, a little less combative with my mother. Words have power. Incredible, life-altering power, life-wrecking, life-constructing power. I think perhaps the biggest lie we ever tell ourselves and we tell children is that sticks and stones may break bones, but words will never hurt me. If you've ever had a blow up with a friend or a family member or a coworker or anyone that's hurt you with words, you know that words hurt. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words, they leave scars that last a long time. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can end a relationship. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can cost you a lifelong friend. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words create doubt in me that erode my sense of self-worth and my sense of confidence. Such a strange thing. This tiny muscle resting in our mouth with multiple purposes, to taste, to help us swallow, but to form words. It's probably the most dangerous, destructive thing about us. Our words, how we speak, it's incredibly important. If you go back to the book of Genesis, in the second chapter of Genesis, the second creation story, we see the first human being is given the power of speech. And Adam has been given that task of naming all the living creatures. The first and most important gift that human beings get, the thing that sets them apart from the animal kingdom, is the power to name, to create language, and therefore use that language to shape the world around us. It is with speech itself that universe and life is created. God said, "Let there be light." And we, like God, use speech to shape our world because we are constantly telling ourselves and others the story of who we are and why we're here and what we're doing. Maybe it's not always speech out loud. Maybe it's just the speech you're telling yourself in your head. But even that, it builds the world around us. James understands that. He understands the power of the tongue. He's been talking about speech throughout this whole letter. It's not just reserved for these passages. He knows bad speech when he sees it. When we claim that our temptations are actually coming from God, nope, that's bad speech. When we flatter the rich, yet are scornful of the poor, it's bad speech. When we say we wish well for the poor, but don't do anything about it. When we claim to have faith, but our lives are devoid of any evidence that that faith actually exists. When we judge or we slander fellow Christians. When we boast about all of our glorious plans. When we constantly complain about our sisters and brothers. Yeah, that's bad speech. James is talking about it all over this letter. And yet what complicates this in our world is that speech is more than just the noises made by our mouths, right? We have infinite avenues of expression. Speech can take the form of images and movies and words on the screen that we choose and project out of ourselves. Speech can be text messages, Snapchat snaps, Facebook posts and comments, retweets and favorites on Twitter, images shared on Instagram and Flickr, blog posts and comment threads and live streams and boomerangs and shareable gifts and articles you share online. There are infinite things that we can say are some manner of our speech. And we live in this information age where everything is searchable and available to us in an instant. And yet understanding what's going on in this world around us has somehow gotten more difficult. The author Bill McKibben calls this the age of missing information, where the important things we need to know have been drowned out by advertising, celebrity product placements, 24/7 cable news, viral videos, streaming TV, movies, Twitter bots, having 200 channels at our fingertips at every second. Everything's just a click away, and yet it's hard to find that information. Our speech reaches farther and faster than it ever did before. And all the while, things that we said 4, 5, 10 years ago in disparate places on the internet somehow could be tracked down and brought up against us. On 2 separate occasions this year, in a major league game, a pitcher came to a post-game conference completely unaware that they were about to be blindsided by questions about an old offensive tweet that someone who was against them dug up at the most opportune time. It happened to a reliever on the Brewers in the All-Star game. He pitched the All-Star game. He was the one pitcher that kind of had a bad inning, and he goes to the press conference thinking they're going to ask him about that and said, "So how about that racist tweet you said when you were 16? It happened again a little bit later to a pitcher on the Braves, who was in the middle of a no-hitter at the time. So you have Twitter on one hand saying, oh, you got to watch this, there's this no-hitter going. And on the other hand, all these people saying, yeah, but that guy said something racist 6 years ago. He shows up at the press conference, I believe, giving up 1 to 2 hits, thinking they're going to talk about this. The highlight of his year, the best game pitched? Nope. What'd you say a few years ago? And so speech for us is very different than speech for James. And yet the principle is true. Words matter. The tongue, our speech, the way we project ourselves, it reflects our character, the directions our lives are taking. Our speech directs our action, and our actions ultimately reflect who we are. Speech and action, they are intimately intertwined in the way James sees faith. They are so intertwined that James's number one concern in this entire book is that they should be aligned. They should be going about the same thing. That's what James wants in all this, consistency. That's the funny thing. He's not criticizing people that say bad things with their mouth and then go do bad things. Those aren't the people he's criticizing. The people he's criticizing are the ones that can't make up their mind what they're going to be. In the previous 2 weeks, we've hinted about this in worship, and Ashley, in the first reading of Scripture, actually highlighted this, that the book of James is rooted in this ancient tradition called wisdom literature. It's a writing style that you find in the Old Testament, in books like Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. But James is a book of wisdom literature. It is the only one in the New Testament that we would call a wisdom literature book. And the fingerprints of the style are all over James' writing. He appeals over and over to examples out of nature to explain a divine truth. The tongue is like a bridle in a horse's mouth. It's small, but with it you can control the whole beast. It's like the rudder of a ship, tiny in comparison to the ship, but it directs where it goes. It's like a small flame, and just the tiniest spark can set the entire forest on fire. James is rooted in that wisdom tradition. He's rooted in classic Jewish theology that says there are two sides to human nature. There's both this wonderful capacity for righteousness and goodness and mercy and kindness, and yet at the same time we have this capacity for wickedness. And it is in language, our speech, where that becomes most evident. I saw this article this week about a group of scientists that had claimed to fully domesticated certain red foxes. It's a process that took nearly 60 years in Siberia, of all places. It involved the selecting breeding of foxes that weren't aggressive and were a little more friendly to humans. This process of domesticating animals isn't so much about behavioral training, it's about their genetics. And that's happening a lot in exotic pets. People are trying to come up with more domesticated forms of all sorts of exotic things. There's a whole cottage industry for raising exotic pets, and there's fame and money to be had. Don't believe me? Just go home today and Google pet YouTube. Don't blame me if you get lost for about 4 hours of crazy pet videos on YouTube. There's internet celebrities with millions of views and hundreds and thousands of followers that will show up at any place to see them just talk about their pets. We've domesticated almost every creature imaginable, or at least got them to the point that they're not going to kill us. And yet, it is the tongue, just as James said back then, 2,000 years later, we say now, it is the tongue that is too wild, it is too unruly. Our language is wild. It has the capacity for great good and great harm. It's like living with a pet that you know is going to bite you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's only a matter of time. So what's James getting at in this passage? Kind of sounds a little hopeless at some point. Well, it's a wild animal, good luck. Certainly speech and action, they should line up. What we say we believe, yeah, we should try to live it out. We should be consistent. Throughout this whole letter, he's been highly critical of lots of different types of speech. We talked about them: angry speech, unbridled speech. But in these specific verses, I think James is talking about something subtly different. And this is the message I think we're called to take home today. I mentioned earlier, you noticed there was this connection between these passages and the creation stories in Genesis. There was that connection we talked about in Genesis 2, the second creation story, where God gives humanity speech and they name the animals. But I think the core issue James is talking about today actually comes from Genesis 1, the first creation story, the one that we're a little more familiar with. Let there be light, 6 days of creating, God on the seventh day resting. I want to zero in on James and those verses 9 through 10. So here it is once more. With it, the tongue, with it we both bless the Lord the Father and curse human beings made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come from the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, it just shouldn't be this way. That connection to Genesis is embedded right there in verse 9. Did you catch it? With it we both bless the Lord and Father and curse human beings made in God's likeness. There it is, the callback to those early verses in Genesis. It was the callback to creation, to who we were created to be and who we are. There it is, right there in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." The fundamental, raw, core, elemental nature of every human being is that you have been created in God's image. The theological way of saying this would be, we'd say it's the imago Dei, the image of God. There are no exceptions to this. It is how you have been designed by your Creator. You might not see it in yourself, but it's there. Everywhere you go, you are bearing the image of God. The Rabbi Joshua ben Levi described it this way: a procession of angels passes before each person. A procession of angels goes before each of us, heralding to everyone who will hear, "Make way for the image of God." Could you imagine that? Imagine that this week when you're walking around. Literally angels walking before you, saying to everyone who would listen, "Make way for the image of God." And they're saying that about you. Every person bears the image of God. Each one demands our respect. There's a study that came out recently from researchers at Vanderbilt University and the University of California, and they were studying the effects of political polarization. And they found that the more strongly one identifies with a particular political party, the more likely they are to use dehumanizing terms when talking about those they disagree with. We live in extremely polarized society. It seems like every issue, everything you can imagine, we have sorted ourselves into these very defined categories, and we stand across the great divide, unable to see the humanity in each other, unable to see God's image in other individuals. I'm not talking about just politics here, but I do think our political discourse has set the tone. We seem incapable of being able to see the image of God in human beings different from us, who believe different things, who have lived different lives, who look differently from us. Have you ever thought about it this way? If all human beings are created in the image of God and I isolate myself from that diversity and I dehumanize the people as I see as being other, I am literally robbing myself of seeing a fuller picture of God's image. Nothing reveals the destructive power of speech more than nakedly dehumanizing other human beings. Nothing so vividly reveals our double-mindedness than to have the very same mouth spew both blessings and curses. I can stand with my tongue in the presence of God and say, "Holy God, I bless you. You are beautiful," and yet turn around and say to a fellow human being, "Damn you. God, you are holy, blessed, and wonderful," but those people are animals. They are lazy and they are worthless. God, thank you for saving me. Thank you for giving me this vision of your kingdom. Yeah, sure, the poor need help, but you reap what you sow. Just a leech on society. How is it even possible? I think that's the tone James is using here. He's exasperated. How can fresh water and salt water come from the same spring? We are called to pay attention to the language we use. We are called to look at one another and see the image of God, to affirm every single human being has dignity, has worth, bears the image of God. Black people, brown people, white people, gay people, straight people, lesbians, bisexual, transgender, legal residents, immigrants or undocumented aliens, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, agnostics, atheists, Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, socialists, male, female, intersex, disabled, able-bodied. Every single one of us is created in the image of God. That's the way it is. That is your elemental nature. So how can I praise God and deny that in you? God is calling us to speech that uplifts, that encourages, that teaches us wisdom and resonates as true. God is calling us to language that reflects the inherent dignity and worth of each and every one of us. So may God give us the strength to tame our tongues. Amen.